Okay, so we're going to do it in three parts today. We'll do a little bit on VMware strategy and focus. We'll then move on to the everything on the truck presentation, and then myself and Simran will be doing a Q&A session afterwards. So we'll get started with everything on the truck and the strategy side of things. So the things we're going to talk about today fall into roughly 5 different categories, but we still have this build, run, manage, connect and protect idea around any app, any cloud, any device. I would imagine that if you've been here for any amount of time, you've probably seen the any app, any cloud, any device slide a number of times. But what is new are these new categories. So we drop things into buckets around app modernization, multi-cloud, digital workspace, intrinsic security, and virtual cloud network. So most of the things that you will see will logically belong in one of those families. And as I say, this is a newer concept, just making sure that everybody's seen these because they're a relatively new part of the business. But you'll see everything land in one of those, but we haven't abandoned any app, any cloud, any device. They're just different categories for things that they logically fall into. So what we're going to do, we're going to work through this and go through things in order. So what we'll do here is we'll start with the everything on the truck presentation, which basically goes through all the different products and services and things that we have to sell customers. Called everything on the truck because that's what one of the salesperson called it one time, that this was basically everything that we had on the truck to sell. So we start with Vcenter, Vsphere, vSAN and NSX. So most of our customers have had a long history of Vcenter and Vsphere, but we're kind of moving people along now to vSAN and NSX, and those three things together being VMware Cloud Foundation, or VCF. Again, you probably heard lots about VCF already. VCF has become the new vCenter and vSphere. It's a way of extending just software-defined compute, things like virtualizing processors and memory, moving into doing software-defined storage and software-defined networking, but doing it in a way that you can deploy it in data centers or cloud providers and have this common platform across a hybrid cloud. So that's the bit where people normally start. The way that people tend to buy these days is on something called a hyper-converged appliance. So you may see things like VxRail from Dell and similar offerings from HP and other vendors, but we tend to find that customers like to buy these as a building block. So it's almost like a Lego or building block mentality where you buy more bricks as you need them and you put a new brick in and you take an old one out. So you hopefully never have to go through long refresh cycles and upgrades because basically everything's compatible. So you just buy as much as you need and it's almost like a rolling replacement. So that's the way that people are building, traditionally the first data center or the one on-prem. But it's also common for our customers to have a second data center or multiple data centers, so that if there's some kind of accident or outage or natural disaster that takes out one data center, it doesn't affect the other data center. So we do this for high availability and fault tolerance and disaster recovery. It's just a good practice for most of our customers to have more than one data center so that a single event can't take out the business. And that software that we run in the second data center is exactly the same software stack that you'd run on the primary or first data center. And this is where we get into thinking more in terms of platforms rather than individual pieces of infrastructure. Because once you've got a platform, you can kind of forget about what's underneath a little bit and focus more on applications and services and delivering things to end users rather than makes and models of storage arrays and network cards and those kinds of things. So this is, your customer starts with something like this. Generally, it has a second or third data center, but increasingly we're seeing people use a VMware cloud provider as the second or third data center. So this is where a partner like Amazon Web Services, Google or Microsoft or any number of, I think there's currently 4,300 other partners, but that's where a partner or a cloud provider provides a VMware platform on their own hardware. So they're providing the same software stack, vSphere, vSAN, and NSX, but delivered as a cloud service. So I'll just pause for a second there, just in case anybody's got any questions or if there's anything you want to ask about that, Stephanie.
I have a question.
Yep.
What's the difference between vCenter and vSphere?
Okay, so vSphere is the software that takes processors and memory and shares them out across virtual machines. And Vcenter is a way of centrally managing lots of Vsphere or VMware servers. So this is the tool that does the job, and this is the tool that manages the servers. So you could almost imagine this being like players in a football team and then a manager. So one actually does the work and the other one is a central point of management for all the VMware products.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions on any of that? Sorry.
Yeah, I've got another question. So when you talk about the data center and then VMware Cloud, are you talking about, is that what you're talking about commercial cloud there, or is that VMware's direct cloud?
So this predominantly, when we talk about VMware Cloud, there are 4,300 VMware providers, but normally it's people predominantly talk about Amazon, so VMC on AWS, Google Cloud VMware Engine, or Microsoft Azure VMware solution. But this is third parties providing VMware software in a hybrid cloud environment.
Copy that. Thank you.
So as VMware does partner closer with Amazon than the other cloud providers, but it is a service run on Amazon's hardware, not ours. The other option you've got is then the cloud providers natively, so native Amazon, native Google, and native Azure, as in the hypervisors and storage solutions and network solutions that cloud provider provides natively, rather than the VMware flavored versions of these solutions. And then just for completeness, the other way that customers might deploy applications and services would be through SaaS or software as a service. So the most common ones being things like Salesforce, but also you could consider things like Spotify as being a SaaS service, although you have a piece of software installed on your phone or your tablet, the bulk of the service is provided remotely by another organization. But SaaS again is becoming another common way to consume applications and services if you don't want to run it yourself. But that's probably representative of how most customer landscapes will look. They'll have at least one data center, possibly other data centers, or possibly a hybrid cloud. People starting to look more at public cloud, and people definitely looking at delivering applications and services through SaaS if the vendor offers that as a solution. The way that we join all these together, or the way that we optimize the way that these are joined together, is with something called HCX. So technically it's just called HCX, but internally you'll hear people refer to it as hybrid cloud extension, but I don't think that's an official name for it. It's just what we call it internally. I think if you look on the public literature, it's just HCX, but it is a tool for doing hybrid cloud extensions. And it not only accelerates the performance of the network between different data centers and cloud providers, it also makes the network look like a single network. So it can stretch the network in a way that doesn't break things, because it is possible to stretch networks across clouds, but you can end up with problems at a network layer when you stretch a network too far. So most network administrators don't like stretching networks, but this HCX tool does it in a way that doesn't break things. So it's a tool for stretching networks or using a common network between data centers and cloud providers, but it also accelerates the performance of the bandwidth between them. So any questions on HCX, because it's quite a common one we get asked questions on.
Is this the SD-WAN?
It's not the SD-WAN, but it is very similar. So HCX is more about connecting your own data centers or hybrid cloud data centers together. And the and this tends to be used for migrations and moving things backwards and forwards, and it tends to be used by IT departments mainly. When you look at SD-WAN, that's normally deployed across internet connections, and it's normally used by actual staff or end users, and it can be used for lots of things. It does allow you to connect between branch offices, but but SD-WAN can also speed up things like internet connections, things like Office 365, things like home working. So one of them is aimed more at internet connections and end users, and one of them is focused more on data centers and migrations. But there is a similar, this accelerating networks and speeding things up is definitely a common thread. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think so.
So what we'll do, we'll talk about VeloCloud and SD-WAN a little bit later on. And if it still doesn't seem obvious, then we'll come back to it. But you're not alone. It's a common question we get asked. And I guess the two things were developed independently, but they do on the surface appear to do very similar things. But
Okay,
one's more focused on users and applications, and one's more focused on data centers and migrations of virtual machines and containers and modern applications. So we'll come back to it afterwards if we don't answer your question as we move along. One thing that we're able to do, because we've got this common software stack of things like Vsphere, vSAN, and NSX, we can replicate information or copy information between data centers. So I can make sure that if I have an application or a service running here, I make sure that I replicate that data so that if I have a problem on this data center, I'm able to recover it on this one, or even a cloud provider. So this replication works backwards and forwards in all directions, and it's a way of making sure we've got multiple copies of applications and data just in case something happens to one of our cloud providers or data centers. What I will say about it is we move the data for you, but you still have to recover it yourself. You still have to go through the process of bringing up those machines and deciding what order to bring them up in, and those kinds of things. A companion product, but an additional paid for product is Site Recovery Manager, and that automates a lot of this in that it allows you to create something we call a run book, which is a list of which virtual machines need to be brought up in which order, which virtual machines are parts of which applications, because it's quite common that applications need multiple virtual machines, and it's a way of, in an organized fashion, recovering a data center or a site using an additional tool. And it also allows you to practice a disaster recovery or a disaster recovery plan, so you can make sure that it's going to work before you need it. So storage replication is included in all paid for copies of Vsphere, but Site Recovery and Site Recovery Manager is an extra product that we sell to customers who need that kind of extra level of assurance. So any questions on any of that?
Yes, I do have a question.
Oh,
Hello?
Yep.
So, okay, when you have when you use the recovery manager, or
Yep.
let's say you move your apps and your VMs to the cloud, let's say you need them to come back on premise.
Yep.
We protect them with NSX. In that meantime, where they're coming from the cloud to our data center, could you tell me a little bit more about how our protection works in that instance?
Okay, so we'll just clarify protection, because it can mean a few different things. We can mean protection in that we're making sure that we never lose a copy of an application or a service, and we can mean protection as in from a security point of view, we make sure that it's secure from a vulnerabilities and attacker point of view. So from a storage point of view, we protect it because we allow you to make additional copies of the data, and we make sure that you can restore them or you can recover them and bring them back. So that's the first level of protection. But yes, we've also got a kind of security protection in NSX, and the security rules and security policies around a virtual machine. So let's say we've got a virtual machine in data center 1. That security policy and networking policy will follow the virtual machine if we move it from data center 1 to data center 2. So the firewall rules will disappear here, and they'll get created here when the virtual machine moves. And if we move it again to the cloud, the security policy and the firewall policy will move with it. So when we do things policy driven, it belongs to the virtual machine, not the site. So as you move things around, all those policies and all those security settings and firewall settings and network settings actually follow the virtual machine round. Does that kind of help?
Absolutely. Thank you.
It's one of the key things about our software and our tools is that when you move things, the settings and the configuration and the stuff that makes it work actually follows the virtual machine around, not the data center. So all those things we've talked about there under that line are all pretty much around infrastructure. We're making sure that the infrastructure looks consistent, that you can move things around from one place to another without having to re-engineer or rewrite everything. And the idea is that we have intrinsic security built in at those layers. So security is something we consider from day one, not just add on afterwards, like lots of organizations do. So below that line is all infrastructure and consistent infrastructure. So regardless of whether it's in your data center on Dell kit, or it's in Data Center 2 on HP kit or Cisco kit, or in a cloud provider, we just want the ability to move things around and use it as a single platform. So we're turning it from infrastructure into a platform, which is why the software we use for it is called VMware Cloud Foundation. It's the foundation for an application and service platform. The next thing up from that is when we look at actually doing the operational side of things, so monitoring and managing it. So there are lots of tools up here. The ones I'm going to cover more than anything are things like Vrops and Wavefront, which look at things like health, risk, efficiency, waste, and just general operations of the environment. It is quite common for customers who've got a lot of on-prem equipment to have Vrops already in place. Wavefront was a relatively recent acquisition, which is more of a SaaS-based solution. So there is a little bit of overlap here, but what I would say is that Wavefront is absolutely laser focused on application and user experience, whereas Vrops has traditionally been more focused on infrastructure and operational stuff. So one looks at the infrastructure up to applications, and one looks at applications down to infrastructure. So as I say, you may see that over time, all those capabilities may, kind of overlap and cross over, but we've got Vrops and Wavefront for that operational type stuff. We've got, actually, just before I go any further, any questions about Vrops and Wavefront before I move on?
Yeah, I guess just in general.
Hi, there's a question not on the VROPS, but just wondering how HCX is different than vMotion. Is it an extension to vMotion, or is it
How is what different?
The HCX
Okay.
to vMotion?
So HCX is a technology that speeds up the network and makes the network look like one flat thing, or one consistent thing. And actually, when you do a migration over HCX, it's quite common to do a long distance vMotion. So it almost gives more capabilities to vMotion. So the two work together.
Is there an issue with the amount of time, right, latency associated with HCX doing vMotion over distance from, say, one cloud provider to another, or can that actually be done real time with no issue on a functioning workload?
Okay, so there's a couple of different points here. So the first one is latency, and what we tend to say to people is that you should ideally have less than 150 milliseconds of latency for these kinds of things to work. But to be honest, if you've got 150 milliseconds of latency, you've got lots of other problems. So that's not a really kind of a difficult or a strict one. What I will say about HCX is we can do bulk migrations, which are done cold. So the virtual machines are powered off, and we can do lots of virtual machines at once. It could be tens or hundreds. But when it comes to live migrations, currently we only support one live migration at once. So yes, you can do them live, but one at once, or you can do tens at once if you do them cold. And there is kind of a thing in between where there's almost like a hidden things we do behind the scenes where we replicate the data first ahead of time, and then we do the migration just to help speed things up. But HCX has got a couple of different ways you can do it. But essentially there's a cold version where you can do lots of things at once and the machines are powered off, and there's a live version or a hot version where we do it without stopping the machine. So for important things, you do them live. For bulk things, you do them cold.
And does this obviously seems like it would help with ingress egress issues if you're changing cloud providers or if you're moving workloads over to different cloud providers? Is that a fair assumption?
It has an impact on ingress and egress, but it doesn't change it. So it depends what you mean by that. I don't know if you want to just explain that a bit more.
Well, I know that most customers, one of the big challenges that customers face is that ingress egress, right? There's a lot of data sitting there. The amount of time it takes to move that data, a lot of times that's what has locked them into certain public cloud providers, right? Or certain cloud providers, period, right? So based on HCX, optimizing the network, right? Optimizing the bandwidth between locations, right? Is that an accurate assessment?
It definitely helps with optimizing bandwidth between, but one of the products we'll come on to a little bit later is called vRealize Network Insight. And this takes the view that it's a better idea to put things in the right place or put things that talk a lot together rather than be speeding up the network between them. So if we know that you have let's say, a web server and a database server that talk to each other a lot, one of the things that vRealize Network Insight will say is you probably should move those two things together to cut down the amount of traffic across the network or hairpinning backwards and forwards. So things like Network Insight will make recommendations about the best way to put things, or even just give you an accurate assessment of the amount of data and the likely amount of data or costs that you're going to have associated with those round trips.
Got it. So this HCX isn't a magic pill to get a bunch of data to another location more quickly or anything like that, right?
Yeah, the best way to think about HCX is if you think about the the speed of the tap or the faucet in your kitchen, and you think about a way to get more water through that pipe is to buy bigger pipes, so you can fit more water through. The alternate way is you put more pressure through the pipe so the water travels faster. And HCX is almost a way of putting more pressure in the pipe so that the water, the bandwidth and the connectivity is faster without having to necessarily increase the size of the pipe or the bandwidth. So we're just trying to make the flow of water quicker through the pipe we've got, rather than having to invest in lots more, kind of bandwidth or infrastructure as well. So it's an optimization tool, really.
Got it. Thank you.
So that was Vrops and Wavefront. The other thing we've got is Log Insight, which is a login and correlation tool. From my experience, when things go wrong in IT, it's because somebody just changed something. So if you want to find out what caused the problem, you need to know what just changed before things went wrong. And a very useful tool for this is Log Insight, because it can pull together all the logs and all the information about all different parts of your platform and correlate them in real time. So you can line up things and see what happened, what just happened before something went wrong, or what the impact was of something going wrong or something failing. So I refer to it as like a root cause analysis tool, or almost like a post-mortem tool, but essentially it's a big central place for collecting logs and information about your services. What I find is that either customers use it massively, they're really into it, or customers don't understand it and they don't use it at all. So there's this big divide between people that know how to use it a lot, and people that don't know how to do it tend to kind of stay away from it. So lots of the work that core engineers and SEs do is to try and educate people how that works, because it's a tool that sometimes our customers don't get a lot of value out of if they're not shown how to use it first. Any questions on Log Insight? No, it's a reasonably straightforward concept. It's not as glamorous as some of the other stuff, but it's a core tool for operations and IT departments. Next one is automation. So the ability to deploy things, do things in an automated fashion, rather than people clicking through buttons by hand. Lots of organizations are seeing the value of organization in that if you're doing something repeatedly or lots of times and you want consistency, automation is just the best way of achieving that. And if you want consistency across different parts of the business, or you want to be able to kind of make sure that things are done the same way, even though you may have lots of contractors or staff changing, again, automation is a way of making sure that things are done in a standardized way, in a repeatable way, with less human interaction. So it's a good way of standardizing things, but also doing more with less people, because most of my customers certainly have got less people in their IT department now than they did have before. It's a big topic actually, automation. Basically we use things called blueprints, which are like plans or designs for deploying things, and once the blueprint is built, it's easy for other people to deploy that blueprint. But any questions on automation before we move on to cloud health? Nope, that's good, because that's a huge topic in itself. Cloud Health is a SaaS service. It can only be bought as a SaaS or subscription service, and it basically looks at the cost of cloud computing, and it can do things like compare different cloud vendors against each other, or on-premise versus cloud. So it's basically something that makes sure that you understand the costs associated with doing cloud or local cloud, private cloud, hybrid cloud, and public cloud, also the differences between the vendors. But I think the most common thing people use it for is to make sure that they're paying for things most efficiently or getting the best value. So one of the things it can do, it can look at your bill, or it can look at your infrastructure and say, if you paid for exactly the same stuff, but you did it this way instead of that way, here's the saving that you would make. And quite commonly it does things like recommend reserved instances or paying for things up front because you're guaranteed to use them, and then paying on demand for other things. So it might just say, if you planned ahead a little bit better, here's the kind of savings you could make. And in simple terms, Cloud Health pays for itself because the amount of money that Cloud Health costs is a fraction of the money it saves you. So if it saves you X amount of pounds, the bill for Cloud Health will be a fraction of the savings. So in my mind, it's a no-brainer because it's free money is probably the wrong way to phrase it, but you pay for it with the savings that the product gives you. Any questions on Cloud Health?
Well, just in general, can you guys hear me?
Sorry, go on. I couldn't quite hear that. Could you speak up a little bit, please?
You're kind of far away.
How about now?
Yeah, that's better.
There you go.
All right. So Wavefront Log Insight Automation Cloud Health, I assume they're making web API calls into, let's say, if you're doing log management, it would be Vsphere and Vcenter, Cloud Health would probably be HCX. Is that the way it's communicating, is through API calls? Because I see the intrinsic security there.
Sometimes for things like Log Insight can do things through API, but actually Log Insight is also a very capable syslog server underneath. So lots of customers actually use it as a syslog server and don't do anything more complicated than that. But there certainly are APIs for it, and there certainly are integrations for it. But I would say most people use it as a syslog server. Cloud Health is very clever in that it will communicate directly with the cloud providers using the cloud APIs and look for pricing. But if you actually enter your own subscription details or your own account details, it will look at your very specific pricing and it'll work out a personal cost based on your actual pricing, not the public pricing. So yeah, Cloud Health does exactly what you say, but it's even more sophisticated because it can use your own credentials to get accurate costings for you.
No, I get it. So, but the Log Insight, even if you used it as your own syslog, the logs would have to get there. So it's either the Log Insight is polling or pulling from Vsphere or Vcenter, or you've set up Vsphere to use a repository that Log Insight is using when it creates its logs. So is it pushing from Vsphere to a repository that Log Insight is using, or is Log Insight pulling the logs? And I'm not trying to focus on Log Insight. It's more about how is it communicating between these visualization layers and the underlying architecture.
Okay, so Log Insight is deployed as an appliance. So it's a virtual machine with its own database and own storage. And some of those logs will be pushed from Vcenter. So Vcenter knows about Log Insight and it will push things there. But let's say it's a load balancer or a switch or a firewall. We can tell the firewall or the load balancer or the switch about Log Insight, and it can send logs to it. So it can work both ways.
Okay, and the communication, I assume, is two-way secure, two-way SSL?
I think it's probably only one way because I don't see why Log Insight would need to talk back to the firewall or the load balancer, but I'm not 100% sure on that, but I would expect that it's only in one direction. So
you're now answering the question that I was going to get to, which is, if it is not two-way because it's mostly a visualization tool, do you actually get to control or manage from, let's say, Wavefront or Log Insight, or is it like a Splunk visualization layer that kind of just visualizes what's going on under that purple line?
Okay, so Log Insight, I would say, is more of a collation. It brings information in and helps you visualize it. For things like Vrops, there are you can tell Vrops that if it has a recommendation or an action that it suggests, that it can actually go and make that, action that recommendation, but it's not done by default. The customer has to allow Vrops to do that, and it's generally for things it understands well. Like, let's say you have a virtual machine that's running out of CPU. It may be that Vrops is allowed to just add that extra CPU itself without requiring a human intervention. So we do have tools that can do that. And there's certain tools that will move things and migrate things, again, without you having to ask. But I'm not sure how deep that goes with Cloud Health. I don't want to tell you something and it turns out to be wrong, but most of these tools can at least make a recommendation, and some of the tools can actually do it for you if you give them permission.
Yeah, so the question that will come up, which I'm thinking right now, which is, if I have a major Splunk environment, why wouldn't I just take the logs directly from under the purple line and feed it into my Splunk instance? Because Splunk has VMware apps and plugins and all of that. so that I have one universe of visualization rather than investing in a separate central cloud management platform by VMware and have Splunk over here on the side doing other things.
You certainly could make an argument that you could do some of the same things with Splunk. So it is one of those things where there are other alternatives. What we tend to find is that VMware, predominantly VMware houses, tend to know and are familiar with LogInsight, but you could absolutely use another tool if you wanted to. So I'm not going to give you a killer argument for one or the other, but what I will say is it's very similar to the stuff that Splunk does, but there's a definite focus and there's definite knowledge inside the product that understands VMware better than third-party tools do.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, so how are we doing for time? Stephanie, we're not too bad, are we? Okay. So the next thing we start. Oh, sorry, I said I was going to talk about Vela Cloud and Verni, and I didn't do. I skipped straight past it. So on the network side of things and the wide area networking, the WAN side of things, a couple of products here. So the first one is known internally as Verni, but it's actually vRealized Network Insight, but you'll quite often hear people just call it Verni. And this is the tool that looks at network visibility. So this can see data flows inside the network. It not only looks at VMware networking and VMware virtual machines and virtual switches, it can also be integrated with your physical switches and firewalls and routers. So it can also pick up information from that, but it basically gives you visibility at a network layer. One of the reasons that people use that is to plan things like micro-segmentation, so they'll use Verni ahead of NSX to actually give it a list of what rules it thinks should be in place. It can tell you which problems or overlapping firewall rules it thinks you've already got, as well as make recommendations as to what it thinks you should have. But it's actually a very good assessment tool as well, because it tells you which applications and services talk to each other. So if I want to move application A from data center 1 into the VMC on AWS or something like that, it would tell you which applications work together, which talk to each other a lot, and how you should move them as a group or together, or what the implications are of not moving them together. So it gives you visibility into the way that traffic and communication is in your environment. But a very thorough and comprehensive tool, but actually an assessment of Verni or VRNI not only helps a customer understand any problems or issues they've got, it helps them understand security groups and micro-segmentation, and it also allows them to understand the flows and the things that are going on in the background. But a very, very useful tool, often used with NSX or before NSX, because it's very good at looking for problems, identifying groups, and then giving you effectively a list of firewall rules that you could use for micro-segmentation. Any questions on Verni? No. If you're not familiar with Verni, it's definitely worth having a conversation with your NSX or security specialist, because I tend to find that customers are really impressed by what it can do, and it starts to lead to other conversations as well. So next one is Vela Cloud. So Vela Cloud was an acquisition that we did a couple of years ago. Most people think of it as a startup, but actually Vela Cloud was one of the few companies that starts with big organizations first. So Vela Cloud's original customers before we acquired them were people like Amazon's, Google's, and Microsoft's, because it's increased the performance, or it kind of had an effect on wide area network and internet connections. And the companies that benefited from those the most were the bigger cloud providers that used lots of networks and bandwidth and wanted optimization. So lots of our customers are surprised to find that Vela Cloud devices are in all the public clouds already. So for example, if Microsoft Azure have got Vela Cloud devices, so if you're an Office 365 customer and Microsoft have got a Vela Cloud device, if you put a Vela Cloud device in your office or your branch office or your data centers, you automatically start to get that acceleration between the two, even though you've only bought one, because lots of organizations and service providers and cloud providers have already got these devices. So it's a nice surprise for customers that they suddenly find that because other providers have got them, once you add one at your end, things start to speed up. So that's kind of one use case for it. The other use case for it is to replace expensive things like MPLS networks and complex VPN networks, because VeloCloud boxes can be plugged in by an end user. It doesn't require an engineer or a specialist, and they will find each other, connect to each other, and create effectively like a hybrid mesh between each other. So you can do things like replace complicated VPN solutions or MPLS solutions and just have a, kind of like a mesh network between endpoints that works really well. Also accelerates traffic, but also is managed centrally from a cloud without needing dedicated staff. So we tend to see these put more in branch offices. And recently, there's probably more interest in VeloCloud on home users' broadband connections, because lots of people want a more stable or a faster connection at home. So we're actually seeing the smaller devices be more popular recently, just because everybody's working from home. But any questions on VeloCloud?
So definitely VeloCloud can be it's an option for not using VPNs.
Yes, it can replace VPNs and it can replace MPLS. To be clear, VeloCloud does actually create a VPN itself internally. It's just that the end user and the IT department don't need to be concerned with it. It's almost like a built-in feature that it just does it for you. So it is a VPN internally, but you don't see it or have to manage it as an end user or engineer. It's all done from the cloud.
Okay, thank you.
Well, because it's a box, let me ask this question. Because it's an actual physical box and it's SD-WAN, I guess the difference, if I'm just thinking out loud, would be, is it doing like a per request security token? Like, is that how it's doing it? So it's, in traditional software defined networking, right, there's a management console that when the person wants to get from A to B, the management console says, hey, are you authenticated? Are you authorized? And then it issues a token for that connection, whether it be per session, per time, per app. Is it doing that? Is that how it's getting around a traditional VPN?
So my understanding is it creates tunnels internally. So essentially the box is going over the public internet, but it already creates its own tunnels between other VeloCloud boxes and between the big devices in the cloud or in service providers. So it is creating VPN tunnels, but it's doing them itself rather than involving an end user or an engineer to do them. So it's almost like as you add one, it kind of just adds itself to the group automatically using the policies that we've set in the cloud. So it is creating tunnels. It's just that there's no complexity at the user or the the person going and deploying its point of view. But my understanding is it is using tunnels internally.
Right. And so just for everybody's, on the MPLS side, it would not replace an MPLS. So a lot of our customers will buy MPLS circuits and they already have them. And if they're on the same network provider, like a Verizon or an AT&T, they can actually drop their traffic in and ride the entire country for free on that private network. And so big offices typically don't do this. The reason probably why we're selling to satellite offices is satellite offices don't buy MPLS circuits. Big headquarters do. They buy internet circuits. So this would be ideal for any customer who has a lot of offices, a lot of small offices, regional offices, and it would cut their cost down dramatically by doing this over MPLS.
It definitely is useful for remote offices and branch offices. I guess it's useful where those remote offices and branch offices don't have technical staff or very many staff. So the fact that an end user can deploy it and plug it in themselves and it just works is useful. But from talking to, I was lucky enough to speak to the founders of VeloCloud when I was in Palo Alto once, and they seemed to think that actually people with MPLS networks were using these as a way of coming off MPLS networks, that they were a cheaper alternative. But as I said, that was just the experience of the founders that I spoke to. They seemed to think that their initial traction was actually as an alternative to MPLS, but as a gradual, kind of phasing off it. But certainly recently, I've seen more interest with home users wanting to get a home broadband connection to work reliably, whilst other people in the house are also working on conference calls or watching Netflix. So I guess it's shifted a little bit for me, just because our own personal circumstances have changed too. But there's a very capable VeloCloud team. So any questions you've got like that, there's more than enough people would be happy to go into it. And they've got quite good presentations and documentation. It's very graphical, so it's easy to see what it's doing. you know, where some things are very technical because you've got to read them, but there's some very simple graphics of how things work. But I think the problem with VeloCloud is there's so many things it can do. Sometimes it's difficult to pick the killer feature because you know, it's not always the same for each customer. The other thing that VeloClouds can do is they can steer traffic down multiple connections. So you might have, in the UK, we have two major types of broadband. We've got ADSL, so DSL over a phone line, and we've got cable providers coming over coax cable. And most houses will have one or the other. But it's becoming a bit more common for people working from home to have both. And a VeloCloud box can connect two different types of internet connection together, or a broadband connection and a 3G or 4G dongle, you know, other things like that. So you've got this ability to bond connections together or use them to make it more reliable or faster. And in some cases, it even does clever things like if you've got a service that needs to be really reliable, you can send packets down multiple connections, and the one that gets there first gets used. So it's actually, you know, deliberately using them all at once to try and get the best performance or lowest latency from multiple connections. But again, very, very interesting product.
And Jason, I'm loving the analogies like I always do. And folks who are joined, I'm loving the questions as well. But I'm going to give you a solid 17-minute warning before we're at the top of the hour.
Right. Okay. The other thing that we'll come on to then is Avi, which is a load balancer, similar to the load balancers we have in NSX, but these are more focused on internet-facing load balancing rather than internal. So we're talking more about lots of people on the internet connecting to services. So I guess what I mean by that is if you imagine shopping or gambling companies, online gambling companies that maybe have lots and lots of users all coming over the internet, they have a big load balancer out on the internet, whereas modern application developers quite like smaller load balancers inside the data center between individual virtual machines. This is more of what the industry sometimes calls a global load balancer. It's big load balancing out on the internet rather than smaller load balancers in between applications and services. So Avi again is a market leader in this, and I'm seeing a lot of traction with this at present, but that's because I'm working with lots of organizations who are doing this kind of thing. But organizations that would traditionally buy a big F5 load balancer are very interested in moving to this V model of doing things rather than buy big pieces of hardware. They want to look at the software defined way of doing that. So in rough, that's what Avi is. Any questions on Avi? No, just in the interest of time, I'm just going to speed up a little bit then. So the next thing we come along to is our modern applications portfolio. So that traditionally revolves around applications running in containers and managed by Kubernetes. So just as we talked down here about Vsphere being the place where the virtual machines run and Vcenter is the thing that manages it, there's kind of a parallel here where containers contain the workload and Kubernetes is more like the things that manages it. So a Kubernetes environment will generally manage lots of containers in the same way that a single vCenter server tends to manage lots of vSphere hosts. So these are the two most popular ways of doing modern applications in a data center. And VMware has a product family called Tanzu. And the thing I need to stress here is Tanzu is not a product, it's the name of a family of products. So we do have things like Tanzu Kubernetes Grid, Tanzu Mission Control, but Tanzu itself is the top level product family, not an actual product. Anybody got any questions about containers, Kubernetes, or Tanzu? Yep, I'll move on then. Next thing we've got, and I'm not going to go into a great deal on this, is something we've got called Bitfusion. This is commonly used for things like artificial intelligence and machine learning. And essentially, it allows you to have a powerful graphics card in one server or VMware host and make it appear as if it's in a different server or VMware host, or the power of the graphics card is distributed across lots of other servers or hosts. So if you want to run lots and lots of virtual machines and you can't put lots and lots of graphics cards or GPUs in each server, what you can do is you can put a graphics card or lots of graphics cards or a big graphics card in one server, and the Bitfusion software effectively stretches that graphics card over the network or shares it out over the network. So it's an alternative to having lots of powerful graphics cards in VMware servers. But again, used predominantly for artificial intelligence and machine learning. Any questions on that one? Nope. Okay. So we did infrastructure at the bottom, we did operations in the middle, and we're coming now to actually, delivering these applications and services to end users. So there are some generalizations made up here. I've got Horizon as being a way of delivering applications and services to laptops, desktops, those kinds of things. I've got Carbon Black in there as a way of securing those devices. It was pointed out on a previous version of this call that Carbon Black actually covers lots of things. Why is it there? But I think the reason I put it there is that that's probably the most visible place that we see Carbon Black. You can run it in the data center inside a hypervisor and in a cloud, but I think most people see Carbon Black running on their laptop or desktop. So that's kind of one of the most common places that we'll see it. But to be clear, Carbon Black has offerings all the way along the product stack from data center to endpoint. It's just that it's probably most visible or most well known on the end user desktop or laptop. And then we've also got Workspace ONE up there as a way of bringing together all those ways of delivering applications, managing mobile devices, doing things like single sign-on and identity management as well. So up at the top, digital workspace, just all the different ways we have of getting applications and services to end users on lots of different types of devices securely with things like single sign-on and identity management. So any questions around any of that digital workspace stuff at the top?
Quickly, if I may, Carbon Black, is it an antivirus?
It is an antivirus, but we class it as next generation antivirus. And the reason for that is that a traditional antivirus will examine every file on your computer for a signature or a known pattern that looks like a virus. And that worked reasonably well when viruses first started coming out. But if you look at malware nowadays, there's estimated to be 500 million different pieces of malware. Now, if your computer has to scan every single file and compare it to signatures for 500 million different types of viruses, we're never going to be able to keep up with that. And it's quite common that when a new virus comes out, some unlucky organizations get hit first, and everybody else waits, sometimes 8 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours before the new signatures arrive to detect it. But if you're unlucky and you get the virus before an antivirus vendor's created a signature, you'll get hit with that virus, like happened with, WannaCry across lots of hospitals in the UK. So people have realized that scanning every single file for every type of virus isn't really scalable. And what Carbon Black does is it looks at behavior. It looks at the way that an application normally behaves, normally responds, normally looks. And if there's a change in its behavior, that's when it suspects that there may be something attached to that virtual machine or that application and service, and starts to look for malicious code or malicious things going on. A way that I've explained it in previous calls is if you think about maybe you've got a child that isn't feeling well. If you took that child to a doctor or nurse, they'd perform lots and lots of tests on that child to see if there was anything wrong with the child. But if you took that child to its parents would know straight away whether that child was okay or not, because they know what that child's behavior is. They know what is normal and what isn't normal. So Carbon Black focuses more on behavior and heuristics rather than running a barrage of tests. I don't know if that helps.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah. And the reason it's next generation is if you look for behavior, you can detect viruses that are brand new that nobody's ever seen before. So a good example would be we ran Carbon Black against WannaCry, the virus, the malware that we had a cyber attack with a couple of years ago, and Carbon Black recognized WannaCry. It didn't know what it was because obviously it was a new virus, but it recognized that it was a virus and it was able to protect environments that it was running on. So that's just a quick example of what Carbon Black is. Was there something in the chat, Stephanie? Am I missing comments in the chat?
Oh, that's just me talking about how you're an analogy king, Shrek, again. Okay. That is all.
Okay.
Jason, maybe quick question, maybe quick follow-up. is there any kind of link yet between the Tanzu portfolio and anything that you just explained on the digital workplace space? Because I could imagine there could be, but then again, maybe not.
There is connection in that Carbon Black can look inside containers and virtual machines. So it looks at it from a platform level. I'm not sure if there's anything specifically for. Well, actually, let me go back on that. It's able to look inside virtual machines and containers and applications and services. So I guess yes, it can do things for modern applications, but I'm not sure that it specifically does. It's just another thing that it's able to look at or cover, in the same way that it's able to look at, you know, desktops and laptops and you know, data centers. So it definitely has a place there, but I'm not sure that there's anything specifically just for modern applications.
Okay, that's fine. Works for me. Thank you.
Yep. And the other thing we're going to come on to on the top is different types of services. So we offer things called VVDs, VMware Validated Designs. I'm pointing this out because some customers are unaware that they exist, but it's basically a reference architecture for deploying our products and services. We've got education services where we will train people up on using our products. And once you've done the education, you can do the certifications. There are certain things like VCA, VMware Certified Associate, where the training is free. The exam is run by a third party. It's run by Pearson Education, and I think it costs about $100, but it's a lifetime qualification. So if a customer wanted to start learning things, they could do the training for free at myvmware.com or VMware Education. And if they wanted to take the exam, unfortunately, it does cost because it's not us that does the exam for them. They do it with Pearson Education. They could have a qualification for it for as little as $100 and, you know, some time on evenings or weekends learning. So, you know, certainly it's worth telling your customers about the free training and the entry-level certifications that they can get, as well as the professional and expert ones available too. One of the services we've got is advisory services. So this is one of those things that talks less about technology and more about business and more about strategy. The example I always give for advisory services is that if you take an organization like Blockbuster Video and you take somebody like Netflix, it wouldn't really have mattered how good Blockbuster Video's IT department were and how good their data centers and infrastructure were. If you fundamentally got the wrong strategy, or a strategy that's not as good as one of your competitors, you know, that strategy is far more important than the, you know, the make and model and type of infrastructure you've got underneath. So advisory services talk to customers about whether they're going in the right direction or whether their strategy for digital transformation or moving forward is correct. And then they talk about what VMware products and services can help them to get there. But this is more a business focus and business led part of the business. The next thing we've got is customer experience and success. So I think we call this Success 365, we call this, but basically people whose job it is to make sure that customers are successful with our products, because they're likely to keep buying our products and maybe buy more of our products. So there's a focus on making sure that customers are happy with what they've got, because otherwise, you know, they don't want to renew or buy any more. We've got PSO delivery, or professional services organization. So a team of people. So that's sometimes engineers, sometimes project managers, sometimes people who are, you know, work face to face with the customer, but essentially a way of our people either deploying our solutions for a customer, or more likely working with a customer to help them design and deploy solutions alongside them. And then very last thing is global support services, GSS, or worldwide support team. So they are some of the people services as well. So I'll just pause for a second there and ask if anybody's got any questions.
It's not sounding like it, Jason. We have 4 minutes left until we are at the top of the hour. Simran, do we have time to fit in what we want to discuss with you today, or should we wrap and possibly send it in the follow-up?
I think we only had Q&A planned for the next section anyway, so I think we're good to go.
Okay. Fantastic,
there is
folks.
a question. Did Jason cover about VCD or vCloud Director?
Okay, so VCD or vCloud Director was a product or service that we had aimed at service providers rather than end users. And VCD is still available. As far as I was aware, it was a product that we thought we may end of life a couple of years ago, but it's so popular that people just don't want to get rid of it or don't want to stop using it. So VCD is traditionally a product that only service providers are allowed to buy, or people that buy it and then resell it to other people. It's not the kind of thing that a traditional end user customer is able to buy from us. Was that the specific question, as in what is it and how is it different?
Yep, I've done anything. Perfect. Yeah, said it does. Any other questions, guys? We have 3 minutes to go, so I guess we can take a couple more questions.
I have one regarding Cloud Health and on-premise. How can Cloud Health give some recommendation regarding cost saving and on-premise vSphere environments?
Okay, so my understanding is there is a connector which allows it to see on-prem, so we can compare basically a little bit like Vrops, I suppose, in that you can look at what's being used. You can make a reasonable assessment as how much that costs, and then look for either more efficient ways of doing it or alternative ways of doing it. So certainly with products like Vrops, we've always got this ability to use a default value for storage or networking or compute, but the customer is able to override that and put in their own specific values if they know that it costs them this X amount of pounds per terabyte or X amount of pounds per server. They can adjust it or tweak it themselves. But it's basically a big database at the back end that looks at what you have and works out various permutations and then compares them against each other. And on the Cloud Health, from a public cloud point of view, it looks at the different ways you can consume cloud computing and if some ways are more cost efficient than others.
Thank you.
Is it correct that you didn't tell anything about Horizon?
We had Horizon at the top. There were no particular questions. I basically said that it's a way of delivering applications and services to end users. So traditionally, it's things like VDI or remote desktop and remote computing. Was there a specific question about it or not?
No, I just didn't catch that most probably. Thank you.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I mean, the stuff at the top is actually some of the most important stuff, because if you don't get an application or a service to an end user, you could argue that a lot of this stuff underneath is irrelevant. People don't have IT for the sake of IT. It's because it provides a benefit to an end user by delivering an application or service which helps them do their job, which helps the organization be successful.
Indeed. Wonderful. Thank you.
And this is the bit that IT departments are judged on as well, because you're as good as the end user's perception. It doesn't matter how great stuff is down here. This is the bit, where the board or your employees actually view you as an IT department and what you're doing. Yeah, I think I was a little bit faster on it than I normally am. I think it was just because I was so behind on time.
Yes, sir. So we are, like I said, right there at noon my time here in Atlanta, Georgia. I know it's the end of the workday for you guys over across the pond. So Jason, Simran, thank you so much for joining. As always, y'all are fantastic for making very complicated products and services seem very simple. So have a fantastic rest of your day. And folks, I will send out the recording later on.